Welcome back to Revenge, Jess. The most effective frauds are built on a prior transaction that went well. That is not a coincidence. It is a methodology. You establish trust through one clean exchange, and you use that established trust as collateral for the next one, the one where you intend to collect. Here's the story a listener sent in. I was a young female college student living abroad in a country where I was still learning the language. My family had hired someone to help navigate that gap. A personal assistant and translator, someone introduced to us through a professional channel, someone who had already handled a phone purchase for several family members without incident. The first transaction had been unremarkable, which is precisely why I didn't think twice about the second one. The price was higher than expected. He offered a payment plan. I was busy, I was young, and I had a data point telling me this person could be trusted. I proceeded. What I received was a refurbished device sold at the price of a new one. Within days, it was presenting another user's iCloud credentials. A detail that, for anyone familiar with how stolen or improperly wiped devices behave, is a fairly unambiguous signal. I contacted him immediately and asked for the receipt, so I could take the matter directly to Apple and establish exactly what I had been sold. That request, routine, reasonable, the kind any legitimate seller would fulfill without hesitation, was the trigger. Not because the request was unreasonable, because it was the moment he understood that resolution was no longer on the table for him. He had already moved on to a different strategy. What followed was not a dispute about a phone. I want to be precise about that. The phone was the pretext. The actual target was a family member of mine, someone with a degree of public recognition, someone whose name, if attached to a scandal, carries weight. He had identified that leverage early, and once the transaction soured, he pivoted to it entirely. He sued me. He sued my family member, who had no involvement in the transaction whatsoever. And then, having told us explicitly that he would do so, he pushed the story into the press. Not because he believed he had a case, because public exposure of someone recognizable was worth more to him than any court outcome. That is the breach, a calculated exploitation of proximity to someone whose name had value, orchestrated by a person whose entire professional role had been to stand close enough to access it. The lawsuit resolved. Cases do, but resolution is not the same as understanding, and I could not shake the conviction that what I had experienced was not an isolated incident, that this man had a pattern, and that I had simply been one entry in a longer ledger. I want to be transparent about the investigation that followed, because transparency is part of what distinguishes this channel from a simple revenge story. What I did was methodical, and some of it was uncomfortable. I built a sustained, long-term intelligence gathering operation around a private individual. I constructed social media profiles to observe his public activity. I cultivated contacts in his network. I had someone I trusted integrate themselves into his social circle, his church community, specifically, to develop a clearer picture of who this person was when he was not performing for an audience he was trying to extract something from. I am not presenting that as above reproach. I am presenting it as what happened, and as what produced results. Because what I found after months of patient accumulation had nothing to do with me, the phone, or the lawsuit. What I found was evidence suggesting that his immigration status, his legal right to be in the country where he had built this entire operation, had been obtained through fraudulent means. Residency fraud is not a peripheral offense. It is a federal matter. It involves deliberate misrepresentation to government authorities, sustained over time, in documents that carry legal weight. It is the kind of conduct that, when it surfaces, has consequences that dwarf whatever triggered the original inquiry. I had not gone looking for this. I had gone looking for a pattern of predatory commercial behavior, the kind that might explain why I wasn't the only person who had experienced something like this. What I found instead was a structural vulnerability in his entire position in this country, a load-bearing wall that had been built on a falsified foundation. I documented what I had. I organized it carefully, and then I made a decision about what to do with it. I submitted an anonymous tip to the relevant federal authorities. That is the entirety of the direct action. I did not publish what I had found. I did not use it as leverage. I did not contact him, warn him, or give him any opportunity to construct a counter-narrative before the information reached the people whose institutional responsibility it was to evaluate it. I submitted a documented, organized report through the appropriate channel, and I released it. I want to dwell on that structure for a moment because I think it is the most instructive part of this file. The temptation, when you have spent months building a dossier on someone who has genuinely wronged you, is to use it in a way that is visible, to make sure they know it came from you, to engineer a confrontation that satisfies something emotional. I understand that impulse. I am not above it, but I had watched this man operate for long enough to understand that visibility was exactly what he knew how to exploit. He had built his entire strategy around public exposure. A visible response from me would have given him a new narrative to work with, one where he was the victim of a targeted campaign by a person with a famous family member and the resources to conduct one. Anonymous submission removed that option entirely. There was no campaign. There was no visible antagonist. There was only a tip, and then, approximately 18 months later, an active federal investigation appearing in the public record under his name. The investigation ran for the better part of a year. I followed the publicly accessible documents with the same systematic attention I had applied to everything else in this file. The sealed materials I could not access. What was accessible told me enough. He was convicted on federal charges related to the residency fraud, sentenced to 1 year of imprisonment, converted to community service. Fined, and now facing deportation proceedings upon completion of his sentence. A consequence that, structurally, means the country he had used as the staging ground for this and other conduct will no longer be available to him as an operating environment. The authorities did that. I handed them a documented starting point. They conducted an independent investigation and reached their own conclusions. That distinction matters, legally, ethically, and in terms of what this case actually demonstrates. The system is slow, but given accurate information, organized and submitted correctly, it moves. There is a version of this story that ends with catharsis. Some clean, final moment where the wrongdoing is punished and the damage it caused is symmetrically reversed. That version is not accurate, and I think you deserve an accurate accounting. What he did to my family member, the public exposure, the media pressure, the reputational cost of being named in a lawsuit that had nothing to do with them. That damage does not disappear because its architect was subsequently convicted of something else. The stress of that period for everyone involved was real and lasting. The violation of having someone use your proximity to another person's name as a financial instrument is not resolved by a conviction on unrelated charges. What the conviction does is close a file. It confirms something I had suspected from the beginning, that what was done to me was not an isolated act of bad judgment by an otherwise ordinary person. It was one expression of a broader behavioral profile, someone who had developed a reliable methodology for identifying and exploiting vulnerability, and who had been doing it long enough and carefully enough that it had taken sustained, patient investigation to surface it. The deportation proceedings mean that methodology loses its current infrastructure. The network, the community positioning, the professional access. All of it is contingent on a legal status that is now under formal challenge as a product of fraud. Whatever he rebuilds, wherever he rebuilds it, he will be doing so without the institutional foundation he constructed here. That is containment, not justice in the complete sense, not restoration, but the permanent, documented removal of a specific threat from a specific operating environment. My family member was innocent. They were used because their name had value to someone who had decided that value was available for extraction. This file exists to say on the record that it was not, and that the person who believed otherwise is now navigating the documented consequences of that miscalculation. This has been another revenge Jess cold-hearted case. The archive does not forget, and neither do I. Subscribe for more cold-hearted cases.